as a general rule, I believe in second chances, and that's what we're going to be doing in this video. In the last few months, I have started 4 different series that I have a variety of feelings about. In this video, we're going to read the sequels to each of those books and figure out which series I actually want to commit to. Obviously, all of these books I liked enough to be interested in the second book, but I'm not completely sold on the idea of completing them already after only having read one book. So let's talk about the books. Let's start with the one that I'm like most convinced I'm going to enjoy and want to continue. And that is The Singing Hill Cycle by Nghi. I read the first one, The Empress of Salt and Fortune, quite recently, and although I don't remember all the details, I feel like it's something that I will want to reread. I remember just absolutely loving the characters and the atmosphere, and remembering like how much was packed into 120 pages. I just couldn't get over it. I was honestly just so impressed and taken with it all. And so I have been very much looking forward to reading When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain, which is the second book. I have heard that in some ways these are all kind of standalone, so I don't think that it's necessary for me to go back and reread the first, even though I don't remember all the details. I read this first one in one sitting, so I think it'll be quite easy to get through, and I have very, very high hopes for this one. I think the second most promising series has to be the Dangerous Damsel series by Holton. I read this first book about a month ago in a reading vlog where I read a bunch of fun and cozy fantasies. This is definitely not what I would describe as a cozy, rather a fun fantasy. This is an absolutely wild, fun, ridiculous romp of a fantasy. It's all about like magical pirates in the Victorian age, and there's a very, very strong romantic element. It was so fast-paced and ridiculous, and it just felt like a whirlwind of a read. And so The League of Gentlewoman Witches is the second book, and I think again it's going to have a very strong historical romantic element with some fantasy as well. In the first book we were following pirates. I think this time clearly we're going to be following some witches. So switching it up, I like it. It's just some good light rompy entertainment. That's how I feel about this, so I am looking forward to book 2. Next we have the Wayward Children series by Seanan and McGuire. I read the first book late last year, and if I'm being completely honest, I did have very high hopes for this that were not quite met, but I think in large part that came down to my expectations not meeting what I actually got in this book. I'd regularly heard this series described as like a whimsical, almost cozy portal fantasy series, and while there are elements of that in this first book at least was much darker than I was anticipating, and like a murder mystery was at the very center of the plot. So I did like it, but I didn't love it in the way that I was hoping to. I do already have the second book though, and because they're so short, I definitely wanted to give it a second chance before deciding whether to continue on with the series or not. So I'm not really sure how this one's gonna go. I feel like it could go either way. I'm hoping that now that my expectations have been readjusted, I'll be able to enjoy this a lot more for what it is. And then finally we have The Thursday Murder Club by Osman. I read the first book, The Thursday Murder Club, over Christmas. And although there were a lot of things about this that I did not love, at the end of the day, I just enjoyed a lot about the tone and the characters. And it was my first like proper murder mystery, and it's left me with an itch to read more. And for those reasons, on top of the fact that I got the second book for a total bargain, I knew I needed to give it one more shot. So I do feel like I'm least likely to continue on with this series after giving it another go, but I love a good underdog story as much as the next person, so I've got my fingers crossed for a strong comeback. So we've got a nice mix of fantasy, romance, and mystery in this vlog, and I for one am looking forward to making some good progress on some series. So let's get to reading. So as expected, I made quick work of When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain by Nghi. It was a one-sitting kind of read, just like the first book was, because these are just so compelling. I'm still in awe how much Nghi manages to fit into these tiny, tiny little books. Like the sense of world building, the atmosphere, the character development, all of it is so impeccable. Obviously we can't get all of the details given the length, but Nghi writes in such a way that I at least felt like I was getting a glimpse into a much larger, wider, more complex world. And that sense of expansiveness outside of this particular story just felt so present on every page. I mentioned earlier that I didn't really remember a lot from the first book. I feel like I remembered more than enough though, and these do kind of read as standalones. We're following Chi, who is this cleric who belongs to this order of some kind called the Singing Hills. And it seems like their job essentially is to travel, to talk to people and record history and stories. That was done so beautifully in the first book. We followed the conversation between Chi and this elderly woman nicknamed Rabbit, who was talking about her life and the role that she played in history. And I think because so much of this story took place just like in a small house and the conversations between Chi and Rabbit, it felt almost cozy and atmospheric, even though like the stakes of Rabbit's life had been very high. This book feels a little bit more immediate. Chi is instead following a much younger person, a very active person. And it does seem like they are recording some of her story, But then they have an encounter with some tigers. These tigers are both human and tigers. They're kind of like these shapeshifters, it seems like. And they announce that they're going to eat Chi and this person that they're traveling with. Chi basically manages to buy them some time by telling these tigers a story. It's a story about another tiger. So obviously the tigers have a lot of investment in how the story is told. And so they're constantly kind of like interrupting Chi to correct their narrative. And so it almost feels like we're watching legend and folklore being solidified, like in real time. And I loved the contrast between the story that Chi had already learnt and was telling and the story that the tigers felt was the correct one. And the implication that whoever the storyteller is, like, influences what becomes known as truth, and how biases bleed into storytelling and the telling of history too. So I'm just really enjoying this series. I was worried that it might be like a bit of a one-hit wonder and then kind of go nowhere with the second. And although it doesn't seem, at least so far, that there's like a linear journey through the books, like I said, it feels like we're getting these little windows and snapshots into what is clearly a rich, vibrant, expansive world. I love how queerness is just kind of like part of this world. It's very normalized. We have Chi, our non-binary storyteller. We have sapphic relationships throughout. Like, queerness is just inherent to this world and this story. And clearly I'm just really enjoying this format of a storyteller learning more about their world and learning how to tell the stories of their world. I love that we are hearing these stories from different people, whether it's Rabbit or the tigers, but then we're also watching Chi as they go about their work and how they obtain these stories and how they learn to tell them. Everything just comes together to feel so atmospheric and mesmerizing and lush. If pressed, I think I would say that I probably enjoyed the first one a little bit more, but overall, I'm just really liking these, and this is definitely a series I need to continue reading. So a very strong start to this video. I couldn't be happier, although I have one very annoying, nitpicky thing that I just have to get off my chest, and that is that Tor published these first two in paperback and has published the next two in hardback, and it doesn't seem like they've published all of the books in one format. And I mean, I'm not the biggest stickler for my series matching, but like, if I have the choice, I would prefer it to match. And the fact that Tor did that mid-series, like, have publishers not learnt? So I'm not sure yet whether I'm going to purchase the hardcover copies of book 3 and 4 and however many we get, or if I'm just going to stick with the Kindle edition for now at least. I suppose I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. I'm sitting here, I'm going to do my makeup soon, I've got my cup of tea, but I just need to talk to you about this book because I loved it so much. I'm not sure if it's quite a 5-star, but it's damn well close. 4.5, 5-star, that kind of territory. That's what we're talking about. I have heard other people describe these books as standalones and that you can kind of dive in wherever you want. And so therefore I shouldn't have to worry too much about spoilers, even though this is the second book. However, I do feel like my knowledge of what happens to our characters in the first book is part of what made this so impactful. Like I mentioned earlier, I didn't love the first book. I thought it was good, but I was not like swept up in it like I was expecting to be. But in that first book, we're introduced to a bunch of kids who are kind of living at this care home. They're children that have at one stage gone missing, and now that they've returned, they're really struggling to fit back into society and often their parents' expectations of them. And so the parents have all sent them off to this home. However, we learn very quickly that these kids all have one very important thing in common, and that is that they didn't just like go missing, they all disappeared into portal fantasy realms. Basically, in this world there are doors, and sometimes some children come across these doors and decide to go through, and they enter into portal fantasy realms that are entirely different to each other. And at least all of the children that we meet in this home, they have a strong desire to return to their portal fantasy realm. They don't feel like this real world is their home anymore. They feel like they belong in that fantasy realm. And so that's why they're struggling so much to fit back in. They don't feel like they should. They don't feel like they belong. In that first book, we're introduced to two twin sisters, Jack and Jill. And although I wouldn't say they are the primary characters in that first book, they're very important to the plot and everything that goes on. So I don't want to spoil what happens. But I will just say that there are definitely strong indications that these two girls have had a very tense, difficult relationship, and that they have a lot of trauma in their past. And that the fantasy realm that they went to together, they had a very different experience of that fantasy realm. This second book is the story of Jack and Jill and the portal fantasy realm that they went to together. We don't dive straight into the portal fantasy element, however. We first get a really incredible introduction into Jack and Jill's parents and then their early upbringing. Basically, Jack and Jill's mum and dad only decided to have children to sort of gain clout in their own social circles. Their mum really wanted a daughter that she could make into the perfect princess, and their father wanted a strong, athletic boy who would be great at sports and who he could show off and brag about to his friends at work. So basically, Jack and Jill were two twin sisters born into a family not so much of love and unconditional love, but instead of expectation. And essentially, when they're born, their parents kind of ascribe very set gender roles to each of them. One of them becomes the cute little princess daughter that their mother dotes on. The other becomes the tomboy who the father can almost like use as a replacement son that he never had. And he even says at one point that having a strong daughter would be better than having a weak son. These stereotypes and gender roles that are enforced on the girls from a very young age do kind of put a wedge between them, like in their twin relationship. But it also kind of starts to ascribe the roles that they can play in society at large and like the way that they experience school and friendship and all of that sort of stuff. And they are also roles that the two girls don't feel very comfortable in. However, when they are 12 years old, they discover a door that of course they enter into, and they find themselves in this portal fantasy realm called the Moors. Immediately they're sort of whisked off to a castle by a man who insists they call him the Master. Immediately as the reader, this guy gives off some creepy vibes, and like I didn't like him. One of the sisters also doesn't really like him, but the other does. And it seems like there's some strange pact between the Master, the owner of this big fancy castle, and this strange, weird, kind of kooky scientist, where each time a child comes through, they kind of seem to take it in turns who will get that child. But of course, this time twins have come through, so they've figured that they're gonna like take one each. It's made clear that Dr. Bleak lives somewhere in like a rundown sort of shack outside of town. Basically, his life is not the glamorous one of a castle, and whichever sister chooses to go with him is going to have to work quite a lot. The girl who decides to stay in the castle will of course be lavished with beautiful dresses and never want for anything, but there is a little bit of a twist, a little bit of a compromise that girl has to make. And the girls surprise both of these men by essentially choosing the opposite that they thought they would. Jacqueline, or Jack, the girl who's always been forced to wear pretty dresses and, you know, do everything that her mother says and never get dirty, decides to go with Dr. Bleak. Jillian, or Jill, the girl who's kind of been forced to be this tomboy, is just really excited about the idea of getting to wear pretty dresses and grow her hair out in a way that she was never allowed to by her father. So she decides to stay in the castle with the Master. And of course, this only heightens the rift between the two sisters. I feel like that's about all I want to tell you as far as the plot's concerned, because obviously it's only a short book, but oh, the emotional journey of this book was just really impactful. It was beautiful. It's essentially a story about how fucked up gender roles are and how these really unhealthy expectations and rigid rules that we place on children can be so harmful. But it's also a story about sisterhood and about love, and there's a beautiful sapphic relationship that develops as well. And so right now I'm just feeling so glad that I did continue on with the series, because I loved it. And I'm so glad that I went into this book with my adjusted expectations. Again, although this is a series following children in these portal fantasy realms, it has a very dark quality to it. And going into this one knowing that, I could just enjoy it for what it was and savor it, and it honestly blew me away. Having said that, I feel like even if I did have like the right expectations going into the first book, I don't know that I would have enjoyed that one as much as this one anyway. I really enjoyed actually being in the fantasy realm rather than just hearing about, like, you know, the fantasy realms that all of these kids went to in the first book. And I think I did definitely prefer the smaller cast that we have in this book. Obviously we've got the two main sisters that are the heart of the book, but then we've got maybe like 5 secondary characters. In the first book, it felt like we were introduced to a lot of characters. Some of them we spent a little bit more time with than others, but I felt like there were a lot of names that I was trying to keep track of, and it felt like there was a lot going on. And I understand that Seanan McGuire needed to introduce us to a lot of characters that we're going to learn more about in the series and the subsequent books. But at least for me, I much preferred this installment. I loved it. So I feel like I almost don't need to state the obvious, but I will be continuing on with this series. I've already ordered the next couple of books. I loved the atmosphere, I loved the tone, I loved the characters, and I can't wait to experience more of this series. I'm a little bit sad that like this is the twins book and we don't get too much more of them in future books. I mean, I think they might still pop up from time to time, but they're not going to be like our primary protagonists again, at least from what I understand. And part of me just wants a whole series of them because I love them and I think there's so much to explore with them. But now that I know what Seanan McGuire can do with these books, and now that I have a better sense of what she's trying to do with these books, I'm honestly just really looking forward to the journey. So another huge success for this video. I am absolutely chuffed. We all knew somewhere deep inside that our streak could not last forever. The League of Gentlewomen Witches. I DNF'd it. I got to chapter 7, which is page 80, so I read, I don't know, maybe like 20% of this. I have to say that although this is written very similarly to the first book in terms of the tone and the language, I just wasn't taken in by it in the same way that I was with the first book. And I'm not sure whether that's just because like the novelty has worn off and I feel like, you know, it's been done before now, or if the setup and the characters just weren't as compelling to me as a reader. Maybe a little bit of both. In this one, we're introduced to some witches who are basically like the arch rivals of the pirates that we met in the first book. Everything has the same level of camp and ridiculousness. That juxtaposition between the polite society ladies of like this Victorian era, with them all being a bunch of murderous thieves. Like the tone from the first book is all there. It just wasn't doing it for me this time around. So I wasn't really enjoying my reading experience all that much, but I was willing to give it the benefit of the doubt and like just continue on and hope that I would sink into it sooner or later. However, in chapter 5, there was a scene that just like utterly repulsed me. And it is supposed to be funny. It's played off as gags, but I don't know, my own sensibilities and my own lived experience means that like I just didn't find it funny. And without going into all the details, basically our protagonist, Charlotte, who is a witch, is trying to steal this object that is currently on display at a museum. But of course, a bunch of other people, including some pirates, are also after this object. So Charlotte is introducing herself to the caretaker of the museum and is like trying to convince him that she is an architect and that she's a doctor, like trying to gain some authority so that she can, you know, weasel her way into the museum. When Alex, the man who is a pirate and a little bit of an antagonist, but who is like clearly being set up to be the romantic interest in this book, sort of butts in and then convinces the curator that Charlotte is not the architect or the doctor that she says she is, which is true, but he does so by saying that it is he who is the doctor and Charlotte is just his wife, and that she gets a little bit confused sometimes, especially when she hasn't taken her meds. And so he very quickly removes any authority Charlotte has sort of like gained herself in this situation by calling her crazy. And Alex pretends to be a tender, doting husband who, you know, has accepted that his wife is crazy, but because she's so beautiful, you know, he does what he can for her. And when Charlotte tries to respond, being like, this is insane, Alex says, it is indeed. I did warn you what would happen if you forgot to take your pills, darling. And he turns to the curator and says, Mrs. Smith is quite unwell, I'm afraid. And back to Charlotte, he says, come, dearest, let's leave the poor man alone. We'll go get your medicine, then tuck you up in a nice cozy bed. Wouldn't you like that? And I get it. They're both thieves. They're both trying to get what they want. And this was like the easiest way for him to do that. But to me, it just felt cheap. And I know it's been played off as comedy, but like I just didn't find it funny. And at the end of the day, I know that we are going to be positioned to root for them as a couple sooner or later. And I just can't see myself doing that. I can't see myself rooting for a man who would weaponize misogyny and mental health stigma in that way. I continued just like finishing the next chapter or two just to see if I could move past it, but I couldn't. I couldn't get over it. So it was time to DNF. Obviously, I had pretty high hopes for this, so this was not the outcome I was hoping for or expecting. But the good news is, like, I have one less series I have to worry about now. So it's not all bad. In fact, speaking of series that I don't have to bother with, I have also finished The Man Who Died Twice. And at the end of the day, I think I felt fairly similarly reading this second book as I did reading the first. And that was that I really liked elements. In particular, I liked the characters. But the actual plot and the mystery element of it wasn't very compelling or interesting to me as a reader. I have to say there were definitely things about this that I preferred over the first book, which I know is a little bit of a controversial take. People tend to like this one the least, from what I can tell. I liked that the cast was smaller. In the first book, it felt like Richard Osman was introducing us to a new character, like named character, and giving them a bit of backstory and everything every other chapter. And there are a lot of chapters in these books. And it was just a little bit much to keep track of. This one, there's still plenty of people involved, but it just feels like he was a little bit more restrained in, you know, selecting which characters he was going to like properly introduce us to. I also have to admit that even though I didn't really love this book, I did cry twice during it. I just teared up a little bit. It wasn't like full on sobs or anything, but all of that was around the character of Ibrahim. I love him, and what happened to him was horrific, and reading it was quite hard. So although these are often described as cozy mysteries, and I think in a lot of ways they are, I mean, there's some pretty heavy stuff occasionally in the books as well. Also, and this is like a very vague, minor spoiler if you haven't read the series at all, but you intend to. And that is, in the first book, Elizabeth, our main character, she kind of is one of those people who can just like contact someone and get information. And like, she just seems to be someone in the know, and like she knows what to do and how to do it. And so she feels almost like this James Bond kind of character, but she's just like an 80-year-old lady. In this book, we just get the full James Bondification of Elizabeth. And I do feel like that did remove a little bit of the charm of just like, you know, the small town, these elderly people. And so the cozy tone and atmosphere was lost a little bit. Having said that, I kind of liked leaning into that a little bit more too. I think one of my main criticisms of the first book was that it just sort of felt like you were waiting for Elizabeth to come back to you with information rather than following her as she discovered that information. I feel like we got a little bit more of that in this book because we got to see her in action. So I don't know, I guess what I'm saying is this was a little bit of a mixed bag. And while I still love the characters and I still like a lot about this, I didn't love the overall reading experience. I guess I like the characters so much that I almost wish it was more cozy, that we lent more into the cozy stuff rather than the almost like ridiculous action adventure kind of comedy movie feeling that it all has by the end. And to be fair, despite their size, they're very quick, easy reads. I didn't really feel the need to DNF it in the same way that I wanted to DNF the Gentlewomen Witches or whatever it's called. And so I don't know that I'm like hard DNFing this series in the same way that I'm DNFing the Dangerous Damsel series. I can see a world in which I'd just be kind of like in the mood for the third book and I wouldn't stop myself from reading it if that were the case. So although I am a little bit sad about these two, as I said, like we've still got the silver lining of the fact that I've knocked off 2 series off my list. And although no, DNFing a series is not as satisfying as actually finishing one, taking 2 series off my list is still, like, it's a bit of a relief, to be perfectly honest. I have too many series on that list, and so to remove, bless you. And so to be able to remove series that aren't quite doing it for me and instead just, you know, focus on the ones that I am really into, I think that's the way to go. And of course, speaking of, right, you were making a lot of noise for a little dog, Ollie. Yeah. And speaking of series that I am really looking forward to, both of these, I know they're just novellas, but man, there's something to be said for a really good, solid novella. You can't beat it. Both of these were 4+ stars. And like, that's the energy I want when I'm deciding which series to continue with. I don't want to be wasting my time on things that are just okay. I want to be reading things that I'm excited about. And these two, I definitely am. Just in case it wasn't already abundantly clear, this was my personal order of enjoyment. I loved Down Among the Sticks and Bones the most. A very close second was When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain. And then there is a very big gap between books 2 and 3. But I would say that I probably preferred The Man Who Died Twice a little bit more than The League of Gentlewomen Witches. I mean, obviously, I managed to finish it, so that says something. As I've mentioned a few times now, I did read the first book in the Thursday Murder Club in a vlog over Christmas. So if you would like to hear my thoughts in a little bit more detail on that book, you can check out that video right here. It was super cute, super fun. I read some books while hanging out with my family over Christmas. If you've read any of these series, I would love to hear in the comments below what your thoughts were. Have I made the right choice? Let me know. A big thank you as always to my wonderful patrons, and especially big thank you goes to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie. And a big thank you to you for watching all the way to the end. I will talk to you in the next video. Until then, happy reading. Bye.